Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game. I am Ben.
I'm John.
I got board game.
I got board games. It's Friday.
And so today we're here to review a game that came out in 2017. So not too old, definitely not too old. It's a cooperative real-time game. So two things I like a lot. And that game is called
The Labyrinth.
Jim Henson's Labyrinth. That's what you found.
Just themed to it.
But, I think that's an actual board game though too.
Yeah, there's an old kind of puzzle board game called The Labyrinth where it's like you have this metal ball and you have to manipulate it through to get it to like one of those puzzle type game things.
Yeah. No, but I think there actually is like a Jim Henson's Labyrinth.
Oh, like an actual board game Labyrinth?
Maybe.
Oh, possible. I didn't see that show up, but
as you guys can tell, clearly those two are not what we're talking about. We are talking about Magic Maze. Ooh. So Magic Maze, like I mentioned, came out in 2017. And as the box says, it plays 1 to 8 players and in 15 minutes. And I mean, the age doesn't matter so much in this, I would say, and like in most games actually, but yeah, 1 to 8 players is great, and 15 minutes is pretty accurate. Kind of depends on how much you lose, basically, and want to play again. Mm-hmm. And so the theme of the game, actually, too, if you can kind of tell from the kind of graphical sparkliness to it, not actual sparkles, but the game looks like it's fantasy themed, but the idea is the theme is that you're all these heroes, fantasy heroes, like as you see, like a dwarf and a barbarian and a thief, who basically don't have enough money to get the stuff they need for their adventure. So they're breaking into the Magic Maze Mall, or not even breaking in, just at the Magic Maze Mall, stealing the equipment they need and getting out. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of goofy theme to it. The way it actually plays is, as I mentioned, a real-time co-op game. And so to give you an idea, a rough idea, because the game is played and set up in scenarios, there's kind of basically the basic rules that are always there. And then with each scenario, the game kind of introduces more single rule at a time to get to like kind of a full game or a game with more going on. But they at least kind of lay down the foundation that is always going to be there. Let us go over to an image of the game set up. Yeah, here you go. So this is kind of an image of the game in progress already. And keep in mind that this is a rendering of the game. And so I know my copy of the game, the tiles are definitely not this thick and are not like rounded and smooth like that. But just know that these are all tiles, essentially, in this whole stack of tiles. And so these tiles are the tiles that make up the mall that you're going to be playing in. And so the way the game works from the very beginning, the way you're going to set up is you're going to first take out these blue action tiles. And in the corners of them, they have the number for how many, like which ones you use for how many players you're playing with. So you take out the relevant ones, you shuffle them together and deal them randomly to all the players around the table. And so what they look like, though, is mostly just going to be this blue tile with an arrow in a certain direction, north, south, east, west, or up, down, left, right. And then there might be one with this kind of portal symbol, one with this escalator symbol, and one with this search symbol or magnifying glass symbol. And so after you've dealt them out, each player reveals them. This is a co-op game, but you reveal them, put them in front of you, and then you make sure they're all facing the same direction, basically having this north face the same way. It doesn't really matter if it's actually north in real life, just make sure they're all pointing the same way for the sake of the game you're playing. And why that's important is because the other part of setup is you're going to shuffle this deck of tiles, which are these sections of the mall, but you're going to take out the starting tile. You're always going to start on one tile. and you'll put all 4 pawns, this purple, yellow, orange, and green, those are the characters, you'll put them in the center 4 spaces of that starting tile. So you'll only start on 1 tile. And so the way the game plays then is for each player, right, everyone has one of these blue direction tiles. What that is saying is that that is the only action you can do during this game. And so what's different is that you're not assigned to any of the 4 characters. All of you collectively or cooperatively are controlling all 4 of them at any time in real time. But what you can do is simply your one action. So for example, this person up here with this tile, this player can move characters up in this picture. They can move them up or north. And so at any time they can take any character and move them 1 space north and another space north and another space north, right? Like this green character can move all the way north here. And then obviously you can see on the tile, there's walls, so you can't go through walls. And so that's when you have to start cooperating, where if you're trying to move this green character and you're this player with the up direction, you can move them all the way here, but then they hit this orange wall. So then you need the other player with the right direction or the east to move right. Then you can go up again, and then they can go right, and then you can go up. And so then the whole point though, is you're trying to navigate all 4 of these characters through this mall to get to these squares of their color, which are indicated by their weapon symbol, basically, like the yellow is for the sword, and the green person wants the bow and arrow, which is not out yet, which is not revealed yet. But so you're basically exploring this mall, trying to get each character to their item shop. And once all of them are on their own colored item space, then you're gonna try to escape the mall. Basically, they all steal the item at the same time and then try to get out through their own colored exit. Like the purple person's exit is up here right now. And so keep in mind that, as I mentioned, you are all starting on 1 tile. So you need a character or a player with this magnifying glass symbol to eventually, when the character is on the space of their color with their colored magnifying glass, to search. And that means taking the top tile from the deck and placing it and connecting it to the tile you're on. So that's how you search and expand the map. You kind of build the map as you're going, because you need to eventually find the tile in the stack that has each character's item shop to get them to it, and their own exit to eventually have them exit. And so the other symbols, like I mentioned, aside from the arrows and the directions that you can move players, one player will have this escalator symbol. So they're the only player that, when a character is on one end of an escalator, can move a character up the escalator or down the escalator, right? So anyone, right, cooperatively, you could all get this green character to this spot. Like you would need probably this player who has a down motion, move them down, but then this player with the escalator is the one that moves them up to this space. And then you'd have the player with the right, which happens to be the same person, move the green person right. And so it's this kind of dividing up of the movements and this kind of escalator action, search action, and then lastly, this portal action. The player with this symbol can take any character from anywhere and move them to a portal of their color, which is that same kind of swirl on a certain square. And so, which is pretty powerful, right? A really quick movement. And so that's basically all the actions you're gonna play with through this game. And now the 2 key things I would say are added to this are that, one, you can see down here, there is a sand timer. So this game has a timer, it's real time cooperative. So the real time is this 3-minute sand timer, which you can add time to by moving a character onto the sand timer symbol, and each one can only be activated once per game. But then when you move a character onto the sand timer symbol space, you don't reset the timer, but you simply flip over the timer wherever it is at that time. So you want to time that correctly. And then lastly, all of this real-time cooperative timing and movement is going on. There is, again, like some of the games we reviewed recently, limited communication, essentially no communication. So there's no talking to each other, no telling each other where to go. But the one way you can communicate in this game is with this big red pawn here, which is actually this big. It's bigger than the actual characters. Mm-hmm. And how you use this is any player at any time can take this pawn and put it in front of another player, right? Not on the board or anything. You put it in front of a player, and this is called the do something pawn. And that's essentially all you're doing. You're putting it in front of a player to say, do something. Because obviously you can all see each other's action tiles, right? The actions they can do. So you just need to tell them, do something, like do the thing that you can do. But then that player has to figure out what you actually mean, because there's 4 characters on the board that can maybe move in that direction. And so you kind of have to figure it out when someone's telling you to do something. And so those are all the foundational rules. And as I mentioned, as the game goes on, it's always set up in the same way. There's a certain number of tiles that the rules will tell you to put in the deck as you advance into harder scenarios. But then also the earlier scenarios teach you the rules one by one. The movement and the icons and the characters getting their item, escaping, those are the foundation with the timer. But then other things can get added, such as this symbol on the timer means that whenever you do go onto a timer space and flip the time, everyone has to rotate the action tiles that they currently have. So your actions are switched in the middle of the game, or however many times you switch the timer, that's how many times it's going to rotate. And so stuff like that, the symbol, the colors and the item symbols on the characters, those also indicate their fantasy class, like I mentioned, like the thief or barbarian. And so then each character in later scenarios have their own special rules too. For example, the orange one is the dwarf. Later on, you learn that these orange walls, which function pretty much the same as brown walls blocking the path, but they have a little hole in it, meaning that the dwarf is short enough to actually move through that hole. So only he can do that. And so, yeah, the characters have their own little abilities and rules that you learn about later. And yeah, and then it just kind of, each scenario adds a little more, making it harder and harder, bigger and bigger. But those are the foundations to the game. And so with that, we will go back and share our thoughts on Magic Maze. Yeah, John, what do you think?
Starting off, it's way more fun than maybe what it kind of sounds like right now. Obviously, like talking about rules, you kind of have to go through it. But I think one of the beauties of this game is as you start playing the game, it really kind of clicks and it's very quick to pick up. So kind of a combination of pros, moving into pros, as well as this kind of the thoughts of the game is it is very easy to pick up, because that concept and the idea is that you really only have to keep track of one thing to do, especially when you start this game for the first time playing it. Is the only thing you have to really care about or focus on is you got this action in front of you of this one thing that you have to do, which is move a piece in one particular direction. But it's actually, I think that's the fun of this whole game, is the fact of the limited communication and what happens when someone starts taking that little red do something person and putting it in front of you and being like, what am I supposed to do when you have it in front of you? Or if you're the one who has it and you're putting it in front of someone, being like, do something, do something, do something. It really kind of puts this kind of spice to it, because I think when you think of just what the game is, it's like, oh, isn't it just really simple to navigate through this maze, right? But because you're paying attention to a lot of pieces, because the tiles are being laid over time, right? Like it's not something that you can map out before you start the game and easily know exactly what you're supposed to do or where to go. It's like you have to be constantly exploring, you have to be constantly moving through this, and you have to keep track of where people are going, because as we were saying in the rules, when you're searching through these different tiles, certain characters are the ones who are allowed to search in those areas to expand and grow the maze. But as you expand it, you might realize like the warrior in this circumstance, maybe he was exploring on this side here, but his spot is actually over here. So but you need him to keep exploring in other places before you can get him to the shop, because otherwise you're not going to have enough revealed areas for the other characters that need to find their shops as well, right? So it puts a lot of this kind of play into the game of like, what am I supposed to do? How, like, or like, it's like, how do you communicate what you want to do to other players and make sure that they know, like, hey, yes, his shop's here, but we don't want him to go there yet, maybe, right? So I put the do something tile in front of somebody else who does a different move, but they're concentrating on a different character. And it's just like, I don't know what you want me to do. So it makes it very chaotic, which is also kind of the cool thematic aspect of this. Is it's this whole concept of like, you're a bunch of adventurers just running around trying to like get your goods, but you're also avoiding the security, and you're trying to like get like navigate through this maze of a place.
Yeah, I think I do want to just add to that of like I love like the chaos in this game, and it's just so cool because it's designed to be that way. It's not a game that's like designed haphazardly or like with flimsy rules, so then players are just like, what the heck is going on, right? It's more that it just has enough things going on that you're like, okay, what do we focus on? But I can't talk to anyone, so I'm going to focus on this, and they need to understand I'm doing that, but they might not, like, even if you think about it, like there's those 4 characters, right? And I think it's brilliant that you're not assigned to any one of them. Mm-hmm. You can move any of them as if they're your own. But then since there's 4 versus like 1 or 2, right? If it's 1, everyone knows exactly what that one thing should be doing or moving mm-hmm. to. If there are 2, it's pretty easy too, right? You might think like, oh, this one needs to go that way, or this other one needs to go that way. Like you're trying to tell me to move one of them. But then I think putting it at 4 is just such a good number of like, there's just enough outside of what you can all kind of be thinking at the same time of how to move a character or where to move them to. Yeah. And so it's just funny, like with, especially the do something pawn, it like, this is probably one of the funniest things in the game, because it's literally, I mean, it's purposely described that vaguely. Like in the rules, it is actually called the do something pawn. And like, that's all you can tell someone to do by putting it in front of them and be like, do the thing. Julie, do the thing. But it's like, I don't know what you want me to do, but I'm going to do this. And then you have your teammates like, why'd you do it? But they can't say that. So they just have a face on them, and you'll yell at each other after the game, basically. But yeah, this is genius. I think this kind of just do something. I remember seeing a funny little board game comic strip too of like a married couple, and then the wife like puts this in front of the kitchen sink in the dishes. It's like, do something. So yeah, this is so clever. But then that chaos is brilliant too, that it's like designed so well, and along with that, it's clear, right? Like it's clear that this is the only way you can move, and these are the goals: get into those spaces, get out, right? So it's very solid in that way the rules are put together, which I think is really good.
And speaking to that, I think one of the advantages of this game, and actually a really big pro for me too in this, is the fact that this game really forces the cooperative element of the game to have to exist and have to shine. Because we've talked about cooperative games in various, different reviews and stuff of generally the danger of cooperative games is that you tend to you can have alpha gamers or people who like over strategize a game or kind of take over in like telling people how to play or what to do in the game, like whether it's like thinking strategically through the game or whatever. But in this game, it's like, nope, the only thing that you can do is that one thing. So I guess the most you can alpha gamer is take over the do something pawn from somebody and take it. But that also causes chaos, because if you don't keep it open for people to use it effectively and properly, and to let other people kind of use it too, that alpha gamer could cause the group to lose because they're so focused on maybe 1 or 2 uses, but not looking at the other places, because as we were saying, it's hard to keep track of all of these different things at once. So it's actually I think it's a really good quality of this game, especially as a cooperative game, to kind of prevent the alpha gamer aspect from coming into this, to what is a common pitfall or a common issue of a lot of cooperative games.
Yeah, and I think another small way that it helps with that is even just the way the actions are split up, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it's what you're saying, like this no communication. Basically, they can't tell everyone what to do, right? But then it's also just that they themselves can't do it themselves, right? It's like if they could take all the turns in the game, sure, like in a co-op game, they could play it on their own, basically. But this one, it's actually in the rules that like the actions, the directions that people can move are split up, so no one can actually move two directions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in higher player counts, it's either lower or higher player counts. Some of those are doubled up, but in general, it's basically everyone with one direction, and that's their direction. Mm-hmm. And so I think that also helps with it. I do also want to say with the idea of the rules being really clean and clear, even though I mentioned the term like scenarios, this isn't a campaign game. So don't think of it as like a heavy story driven, we need to finish this quest to move on. It's literally just, they're called scenarios, but they're essentially just different setups of the game that get a little more complicated as you go on. So you can choose to start wherever you want. I think they do include a little sheet that you can keep track of, like how well you accomplished different missions. So it seems like a campaign, but it's still just basically different ways to set it up for different difficulties, different amount of rules going on. And I think on that point, it's done really well. Like I mentioned briefly, some of those rules that get introduced later are like the characters each having their own ability to do on the map, right? And that's introduced scenario by scenario, right? Like one scenario introduces one of them, so you could try it out. Then maybe another one or two of them get their ability. Or even from the start, the game, actually what I remembered was the game actually starts with you getting to each character's stores, but then they can exit any exit. Mm-hmm. And then it's like maybe the scenario right after, then you learn, okay, they need to exit from their own colored exits. Mm-hmm. So it just goes step by step, which I think is really helpful in teaching every part of the game as you go. And then you get into interesting things like, actually, I think you reminded me of it, John. Like one of the much later scenarios is, I think, one player being the only one who can use the pawn, but then they can't actually move any characters. So they do need to actually somehow tell everyone else how to go about what they're doing through the pawn. So they're just, once all the rules are introduced, there are some funky scenarios later, which I haven't gotten to, but reading them, I can imagine what they're like, and they could be pretty funny. Yeah, did you have any other pros, John?
I think that covers it. It's just the fun chaos greatness.
I think one small pro I would mention is the sand timer itself. I think that's just a small change on how it's usually used in a real-time game, right? Usually it is a sand timer for the whole amount of time that you get to do something. And then maybe at some point you get the chance to, once it runs out, flip it over. But then I think it's just a little clever touch that it doesn't ever just reset fully. It resets from where it actually reached at that point. Mm-hmm. So if a player accidentally moves a character onto the sand timer symbol too early, like if your timer is only like halfway through, then you're flipping it and essentially not gaining any more time, right? Exactly. Or especially if they move onto it too early, you're losing time, right? You're like, you barely ran through the sand timer and then you flip it, so you got like barely any time left. So then those moments are a little funny because you're trying to like make sure with each other that, once you play it enough, you're making sure like you're set up to have a character next to a sand timer spot if you need it, but then not moving immediately, but then needing to remember you'll need to move it at some point.
Into there, yeah. And that's the other thing. It's like, because if you like, and that's the thing with the unspoken communication, because maybe you're setting up a pawn to be close to going on it, and maybe you and maybe one other player kind of thought that way, but another player didn't see it or hasn't noticed, and then they take that pawn and they start moving it away, right? because that can happen because maybe they just don't see it and they're like, their mind is like, oh, we need to get that character over to their spot. And then you're just like,
dude,
I can't say anything. So I gotta
those
put
moments are hilarious. Especially like early on when it's like, like more like maybe straighter corridors. You're like, okay, I move this character like all the way down this way, and then the other player moves him all the way back, and you're like, what are you doing? I just moved it this way.
And then they take the do something and stick it in front of you, and then you take it and put it back in front of them.
Oh, it's so funny. And I do think the obviously you need to learn to use all the powers, right? Like the search is essential to keep revealing the map, and then the escalators, because those are sometimes the only ways to continue. But then the portals are also interesting, right? Because they take any character to their portal, and that's another point of where it's like, if you're thinking and you're used to the game a bit, that can help you save time a lot by just moving them closer to where you need to, if there's a portal of their color. But then there's also those times where there's that frustration, like similar to the I move this way and then you move them back, where it's like, okay, we got this character all the way here and we need you to move them this way, and then they like teleport them all the way somewhere. It's like, no.
And then that actually harkens back to the beauty of the do something token, which, or like the meeple thing, giant red thing, because it's like this, maybe you do want them to move them to a portal, or maybe you do want them to do something, but you can't specify what exactly you want them to do. So maybe when you move that character into that direction, you want them to move them south, but the person's trying to think like, what do they want me to do? Maybe they want me to move them to a portal, and as soon as they move them, that's it. You can't like there are no take backsies in this game. So once it's moved to the portal, and then everyone is like, ah! But that's the fun part, because it's just like you have to hope that person, like that the others are catching on, or like that person who has that action has caught on. And then, as we were saying, when you get to the people's kind of things start shifting, then it's also trying to remember who has that power now, and if it had to shift, does that person see, or did that person know that we were gonna move it over there?
Yeah. I was gonna mention that with the sand timer. Yeah, the whole rotating your actions whenever you change the time. It's like that idea of also where you're planning this way the whole way because your action is only to move left. So it's like, okay, I know when I need to move left, but then we add more time and we rotate and I'm not left anymore. It's like, oh shoot, you need to know what I was gonna do. But you can't say any of this. So yeah, it's great. And so I think with that, I guess the one thing I would also mention, just to give people an idea, this isn't really a pro, I would say, but just more something to give people an idea of what to expect when playing the game. It's a lot of this chaos that we mentioned and this frustration that you can't express, but it's a light game. So please don't actually get upset about people undoing what you're planning, right? It's about figuring out how to, in a sense, read each other's minds. And in that case, like what you'll experience quite a bit, hopefully, as you play it more is, there are these like kind of corridors like in the image John has, where then, once someone's moving down one of those, you can kind of get an idea that, okay, we need the other players to keep moving them down this corridor, right? There's not that many like branching directions, right? Obviously the branching ones is where issues can be caused, but then hopefully people will then catch on to what you're doing. But yeah, so with the corridors, then, people can jump on. It's not so chaotic that we just can't figure out what's going on. It's like, no, like this is just one path. So let's just keep moving them down this path we're going. And so there's that part that you can kind of expect. And then the other part I was going to mention is you might even come up with a strategy. At least this is the one a friend had proposed really early on when we played, where the tile in the left of John's image here, hopefully that's the right place. That's basically to mark that you've gotten all 4 people onto their item shops, and then you flip it over, and then you indicate that once the person's exited, you put them on that tile to say that they're out of the game. The other side also says you can't portal. So once you steal all the items at the same time, you can't use that portal action anymore, which makes sense, or else it might be too easy. But then what a friend suggested was, okay, when we're moving people around to their shops, and maybe when they're exiting afterward, we should do it in this color order: yellow first, then orange, then green, then purple. It's like, that's like probably the biggest strategy part I can think of in this game. But there's those kind of things that you kind of then can learn together, and then maybe make it a little more easy for you if it is too challenging. So
gamers.
So just some things you can maybe expect when you're playing this. But so now moving on to the cons, the things that maybe didn't work well in the game.
Mm-hmm. I'll be honest, I don't really have too many major cons to the game. I would probably say the biggest maybe feeling of a con, or the feeling of something that didn't feel like it always worked out, is kind of the limitation of the conversation, and that this game is very focused on just like moving these pieces around. So if you're thinking of like board game camaraderie and like speaking to people, this game doesn't really like, you'll be able to talk about the game after, but in the playing of the game, it's kind of what Ben was saying. It's a very light game. It's very kind of simple and fun. So you're not going to have a lot of those really like in-depth, like deep thoughts of like, man, this game was like da 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 da. It's just more like, oh, that was like silly. Like, oh, that was so ridiculous when you didn't move that character over there and you had to do all this stuff. So again, it's not really like a huge con in my perspective, but it's also kind of this sense of like, it doesn't lend too much, especially once people start kind of picking up on the game and how it plays. But I also think that's why they have a lot of the rules that are added into the game. So maybe it is partly because I haven't played with all of the later rules that have all of the complexity that's indicated in the game. And I guess maybe that's another maybe slight con to the game, is if you are gamers who like to play a lot of games or like really get into the game, it's, if you play it based on the rule books and the scenarios, it'll take you some time to really pick up the game. And the pacing of the game is made to, as we were kind of saying, that you should be playing through scenario by scenario to really learn the game over time. Where some people might be like, I just want to play the full game all at once, kind of thing, right? Because maybe you only do board game nights once a week, right? Or like not frequently. So, because this game does require a lot of multiple playthroughs to really get like the best experience, I would say, out of it. But if you don't want to be spending all your time playing this game because it is a light game, that might be a slight turnoff from that kind of perspective. But again, I don't honestly think that's a huge negative, because it is fun to play, right? As we've been talking about, I feel like this game has a lot of just positive designs, where I kind of honestly feel like I'm stretching a little bit about my cons, in all honesty.
So I mean, I would say I do have a few, none of them are that big. But kind of with what you were saying, just to kind of add to that, it's true, like, yeah, it does take time to play through scenarios to learn the rules, unless you want to just jump ahead, but then you have to kind of read back on all those rules and then try to understand it. And it's still not that complicated, but it is like looking at the rule book. That's what I was doing. It's basically the first 7 scenarios are to learn like all the base rules. And then you get into like the basically, I don't know, advanced scenarios, which then kind of just do weird things with what you already know. And so in that way, yeah, it takes time. I mean, not to jump too much back to the pros, but I do find myself when I play this, I do play like a handful of games at a time, because like I mentioned, 15 minutes is what's written on the box. And I would say that's pretty accurate, like 10 to 15 minutes per game, depending on how quickly you lose because you're not watching the time, or how quickly you win. So, but if you're like thinking like going through all 7 games, that's like more than an hour on this light game, right? And you might not want to do that. But then also, if you're playing later on or with people who are more familiar with games, you also don't have to do all 7 every time, right? Mm-hmm. Just pick up from where you left off, kind of an idea. But the con that I would mention, the main one that comes to mind is a common issue with real-time games, and maybe it's made a little more clear in real-time co-op games, because I think in real-time co-op games, that's when a game might add more things going on than if it were just competitive real-time. And so, but then as a real-time game issue is the idea that you have to check yourself on the rules. you know, as in, I forgot the term I'm thinking of, but basically you rules police yourself. And it's in the small ways, right? Like there's definitely times where no one's paying attention to the timer, but we ran out of time, you know? And so it's like, you kind of have to make sure that if you're following the rule that has this real time timer, you have to watch it, you know? Mm-hmm. And then another case is, and a more common one is when people are starting out, they might like, you know, in the hecticness, they'll like move a character through a wall. And in that case, I think the rules actually say like, no, then you just move it back because you couldn't do that. But, you know, you kind of have to police that yourself, that you're not breaking rules like that. And just depending on how well your group is at following rules like that, that could get annoying of like having players always like, stop going through the walls.
This game is so easy. I just tell them like, can't you just move this piece over here? I'm done, right? You basically all moved it. No, just kidding.
I mean, I haven't had that issue too much. Like no one really got upset about it. Maybe it happened like a few times out of all the times I've played. So it's not a big deal, but that is just something to be aware of with real-time games, that you really have to watch it yourself, right? Mm-hmm. That you're following all the rules. Yeah. But then the other con I would mention that's also one of the bigger ones, still not a big one, is that I've had players get annoyed about the do something pawn. And it might be because how I taught it. And that might be because of how I saw it in the video first before I played the game, where when people really got into it, they're not just like gently placing it in front of a player, right? But they're like smashing it in front of a player on the table, like, you know, it's like, go, 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 go. And then like, you know, that sound of like the tapping on the wood at someone, like that can make people frustrated if they don't like that or kind of get really ticked off about that kind of stuff, right? So I think I've had a couple players that have felt that way at times, and yet at the same time, they're the ones who would still do it anyway, you know, of like take it and put it in front of someone and tap it. But I think that's more of a funny part of the game, where it's like, obviously like when things are smooth, you're just gently placing it. But then when you're hectic, you're like demonstrating that you're hectic and like, come on, go. So I don't have an issue with that, but I just know people can get pissed off about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of going off of that a little bit in kind of that kind of connish kind of way too, is it does take a certain level of mental focus to play the game. While we were saying it's a very simple game, like having to be constantly observing the board, right? And there really is no break in this game. So you're kind of basically spending 10 to 15 minutes per session, like really kind of hyper focused on like what is going on the board. So that can also get pretty draining, which, you know, in other games, you can be a little bit more like other types of games that are non real time and stuff. You can be a little bit more casual about like sort of casual about like kind of taking your time thinking about things or kind of going more at your own pace, versus in this kind of game where you are limited by like you're kind of pressured by a timer and then you have to be keeping track of everything on the board. So that could be also kind of a little bit I think it's more of like it can get stressful for people, and if you don't do well in a high pressure or like stress kind of gets to you pretty easily, that could be kind of in a similar way to the tapping, where people can get annoyed by that or kind of frustrated, like, why are you doing that to me kind of thing. It kind of falls along that kind of same line, where some people are like hyper competitive and they'll want to do that and like tap at people because they just want to play the game that way. But then other people, I guess, and that's where it's kind of the dynamic of working and playing the game, kind of sensing how that could be a trigger point. But that's like any game, right? Any game can have trigger points too, which is why it's not like a real knock on the game. It's just more of like, be aware if you're going to pick up this game, like that is something to think about with whatever group you play with, like kind of what is their mentality as they play board games, like. So.
And I think for me, the last two small cons I would mention are, well, let me think. How would I say this? Well, so the first one is that I would mention production wise, it's all right. Like all the pieces are pretty nice. Like the tiles are thick enough. They don't get all flimsy or anything. But and this is just a really small thing, is that this is how everything's set up or stored away in the box. There's a lot of space, like I could even probably put this like down here and still close the lid. And so this game could maybe have been produced in like a box half its size. And that might have made it slightly more appealing, I would say, just like kind of storage wise, putting it onto your game shelf kind of a thing. I mean, I do like the art, and the theme I think is funny, but just production wise, it could have been smaller. But quality wise, it's fine. But then the other thing I was going to mention is just like the theme. Again, in this case, again, the theme is not really that you don't feel like you're shopping, or there's no actual like items that you're picking up and stealing or something. It's more of a move to the right place and then move to the other right place, right? Move in and move out, get in, get out. But I don't know. I think with a light game like this, I'm not really expecting the theme, and I don't think it builds it up that much. It's not like using all this flowery language like this is the world and the elf is doing this spell or stuff. There's just little touches of like, oh, the green character, the elf, later on gets a rule where they can like listen, meaning the characters can like talk to each other. And it's like, oh, okay, that's just like a funny way to, insert it into the game. But yeah, the theme is not really like layered on in this game. And so I didn't expect it with the game. So that's why it's just a small con, right? If you're expecting like some kind of shopping mall fighting game with the fantasy characters, it's like, no, it's just a fast, real time, working together, move in, get out kind of game. And so I didn't expect it, so it's not a big con.
Yeah. One other quick potential con as well, and talking about the materials of the game too, and not that it's bad production, but it's footprint of the game is kind of big. So as you can see in here, because this is a pseudo procedurally generated kind of thing where you're basically revealing tiles as you play through the game, one of the things that could happen is if you don't have enough space on your surface that you're playing on, that actually can cause some problems because you need to place the tiles that direction, because that's how you're moving your units, or like moving the pieces on the board. So the board will expand in that direction. So if you're not playing on a surface that can house all of those tiles, you'll find yourself mid-game needing to like shift the board completely, and that is difficult to do. So that is one other kind of piece, because nothing like locks into place, which is not a bad thing, but it's just like if you need to like move things so that you have the space to like place the next tile, that could be a potential con or like a potential problem as you're playing the game. Again, not a game breaking thing, but it's like if you have a small table that you usually do your tabletop gaming on, you might need to we've played on the floor before, because it's just like we know we'll have space on the floor, and that's mainly the reason why we need to play on the floor. So for that reason, that could be a potential negative too, if you don't have a good space, like enough surface space.
No, that's true. That's a really good point with any of these kind of revealing tiles kind of game. Like I don't know if we mentioned that with like when we did our review of Escape, the Curse of the Dungeon, or
same thing. Yeah,
it's the same idea, right? So those are the cons. And so now going on to our ratings, and John guesses the weight.
Okay.
Do it.
Do something. I think I would give this game a 7, like a solid 7. Rating wise, I think it's a very good game, as we were kind of saying. I think it's well made. Design wise is a solid design. It does what it wants to do. It's a cooperative game like it expects to be. It makes sense with all the rules growing, developing. It teaches new players. This is a great like starter game for people to play. It's a good party game. It's a good have fun game. It doesn't take a lot of commitment to play. Like all these things are really positives, but it doesn't really. I think it's one of those games though for me where it's like I wouldn't mind playing it, but it's also not something that makes me like, oh, I want to keep playing this a lot. It is very much of a, okay, we've played it a few times. Maybe we got a little further than we did the last time, rules wise. That's cool. but I'm like, I probably will want to move on to another game after like a few gameplays of this versus wanting to like just spend a lot of time going back to this game over and over and over kind of feeling to me. And again, like, and that's also not because I don't think any of the cons were that significant to drop it. It really is more of just like thematically what the game actually is and intends to be. It feels like a pretty light game. So it's a fun game, but it probably isn't like, it's not doing anything that seems overly exceptional in board gaming, right? So.
And then the weight?
1.43. Because it has some complexity, but it's pretty simple overall. Because you're usually like keeping track of one or two things. So.
So before I show the weight and my page on Board Game Geek for the game, I will explain that for my rating, I really like the game. And I think, yeah, John 7 makes sense because he would play like a few times and want to move on. Where then for me, I'd be okay playing it like 5 to 7 times on a game night first, as the first game. And I just love the chaos I mentioned in the beginning. I mean, I already love co-op games. I love real time. So having it together and work so clean is great. And I think I do find myself basically recommending this game a lot, or even just suggesting it like at game that's like, what do you want to start with? Like, should we start with Magic Maze? I think another pro I didn't mention, but it does contribute to why I suggest it quite a bit, is because it plays 1 to 8. Never played 1. I feel like that'd be kind of strange, but going up to 8, right? Like for people who are familiar with modern board games, like 4 is the number that's most common for games, and then 5 is all right, but then after you like pushing on from 5 is when you find it hard. It's hard to find games that play that many players unless it's like some kind of social deduction game, right? A lot of games that then don't really have components, aren't as much of a board game, but more of like a social game. And so to actually play up to 8 players, I think is great. Makes it something that I can suggest for big groups. It doesn't work perfectly because once you get the higher player counts, you have people with action tiles that are the same as other players. So maybe 2 players that can move up, and it's like, what's the point? I could just let the other player do that. It's like, sure, but if you are all playing the game, like you could even end up getting in each other's way or being twice as helpful, like, so I think it works. It still works. But yeah, so that it plays that number of players, I suggest it a lot. And so my rating is an
a 1.
An 8.
Ooh,
so very high up there for me.
High rating. And I'm closer to the actual rating.
Yeah, you are. And actually, before starting this video, I was telling John I needed to think about my rating a bit, because I think a while back, probably a couple years, I rated it 8.5. So I had to bring it down to 8 because looking at some of the games I actually rate as 8.5 now, yeah, it's still not something I would want to spend the whole game night playing. It's not like the main focus game. But like I mentioned, I do want to play it more than John. So yeah, an 8 is a game that's very good, enjoy playing, and would suggest it. So that's true. And John guessed the weight of 1.43?
4.3, so I'm 0.3 off. No good.
But yeah, so that is our review of Magic Maze. If you found this interesting, helpful, I hope you get to try out the game. I hope you'll like this video, share it with other people. And if you want to hear more of these kind of reviews, hope you'll subscribe. I'm asking to subscribe.
Yeah.
Do it.
Do something. Do something.
But yeah, if you want to hear more, please subscribe to the channel so you'll get notified of my other videos that go up. And hope you'll share this with friends, family, people you play games with. And until next time, we will see you then. Bye.
Bye.